400 years ago, a man decided to doubt everything he had ever believed. Religion, science, reality, even his own senses. He asked a terrifying question. What if everything around us is an illusion? From that moment, René Descartes began a search for one single truth that could never be questioned, a search that would completely change how humanity understands the mind, reality, and existence itself. Modern science, modern philosophy, and even the way you think about yourself today quietly began with this dangerous experiment in doubt. René Descartes was born on March 31st, 1596, in the small town of La Haye in Touraine, France, during a period when Europe stood on the edge of profound intellectual transformation. The medieval worldview that had dominated thought for centuries was beginning to weaken under the pressures of scientific discovery, religious conflict, and expanding exploration of the natural world. Old certainties were collapsing, yet new foundations had not fully formed. Into this unsettled intellectual landscape came a fragile child who would later attempt one of the most ambitious philosophical projects ever undertaken, to rebuild human knowledge from absolute certainty. Descartes was born into a family of minor nobility. His father served as a magistrate, ensuring financial stability, though his mother died when he was only 1 year old. Raised primarily by relatives and caretakers, young Descartes developed a quiet and introspective temperament. He suffered from delicate health throughout childhood, a condition that unintentionally shaped his intellectual habits. Allowed to remain in bed longer than other students due to weakness, he developed the lifelong practice of extended morning reflection. These solitary hours of thought would later become central to his philosophical method. At the age of 8, Descartes entered the Jesuit College of La Flèche, one of the most advanced educational institutions in Europe. The Jesuits provided rigorous training in classical philosophy, mathematics, theology, logic, and science. Students were taught Aristotelian philosophy, which still dominated European intellectual life, presenting the universe as an ordered system governed by purpose and hierarchy. Descartes excelled academically, yet gradually became dissatisfied. He admired mathematics for its clarity and certainty, but found philosophy filled with disagreement and unresolved debate. Scholars argued endlessly while claiming confidence in conclusions that seemed uncertain. This dissatisfaction planted the seed of his lifelong question. How can knowledge be trusted if intelligent people continually disagree? Rather than accepting inherited authority, Descartes began searching for a method capable of producing certainty equal to mathematics. He suspected that many beliefs accepted as true rested upon unexamined assumptions learned from tradition rather than verified through reason. After completing his education, Descartes chose not to enter a conventional scholarly or religious career. Instead, he traveled extensively across Europe, joining military campaigns, not primarily out of patriotism, but curiosity. Life as a soldier allowed movement between countries during a time of political tension and religious war. Europe was deeply divided following the Protestant Reformation, and intellectual life was shaped by competing claims to truth. These experiences reinforced Descartes' awareness of how cultural upbringing influenced belief. A decisive moment occurred in 1619 while Descartes was stationed in Germany. During a winter retreat, he experienced a series of intense dreams that he later interpreted as transformative insight, whether mystical or psychological. These dreams convinced him that he had discovered the foundation for a universal method of reasoning capable of uniting knowledge across disciplines. He became convinced that human understanding could be reconstructed through systematic doubt followed by rational clarity. From this point forward, Descartes withdrew increasingly from public life to pursue philosophical investigation. He eventually settled in the Dutch Republic, a region known for relative intellectual freedom compared to much of Europe. There he lived quietly, frequently changing residences to maintain privacy. Isolation allowed uninterrupted concentration on mathematics, physics, and philosophy. Descartes approached knowledge with radical boldness. Instead of attempting to confirm existing beliefs, he decided to doubt everything that could possibly be questioned. Sensory perception could deceive. Dreams often appear indistinguishable from waking life. Even mathematical reasoning, he imagined, might be manipulated by a powerful deceiver. By pushing doubt to its extreme limit, Descartes sought something impossible to doubt. Through this process, he arrived at one of the most famous conclusions in intellectual history. Even if all external reality were uncertain, the act of doubting itself proved the existence of the thinker. If he was thinking, he must in some sense exist. From this realization emerged his foundational insight, often summarized as "I think, therefore I am." Existence was established not through observation of the world, but through awareness of thought itself. This discovery marked a turning point in philosophy. Rather than beginning with nature, tradition, or divine authority, Descartes began with the individual mind. Consciousness became the starting point for knowledge. He then attempted to rebuild certainty step by step, arguing that clear and distinct ideas perceived through reason could serve as reliable foundations for science and understanding. Alongside philosophy, Descartes made revolutionary contributions to mathematics. He developed analytic geometry, linking algebra and geometry into a unified system that allowed spatial problems to be expressed numerically. This innovation transformed scientific investigation by enabling mathematical description of physical motion. The coordinate system still used today bears his influence, quietly shaping modern engineering, physics, and technology. Yet Descartes' project extended beyond mathematics. He envisioned the universe itself as a vast mechanical system governed by laws rather than mystical qualities. Nature, in his view, operated through motion and measurable interaction. Animals were understood as complex biological machines, while the human body functioned according to physical principles. However, he maintained that the human mind remained fundamentally distinct from matter, capable of reasoning and self-awareness beyond mechanical explanation. By the time he began publishing his major works, Descartes stood at the center of a new intellectual era. His method promised certainty in an age of doubt, offering a framework through which science could advance independently of theological dispute. Yet his ideas would also provoke controversy, challenge religious authority, and introduce philosophical problems that thinkers would debate for centuries. At this stage of his life, Descartes had laid the foundations of modern rational thought, but the consequences of his ideas, both revolutionary and troubling, were only beginning to unfold. As René Descartes continued his life in the Dutch Republic, he entered the most intellectually productive and carefully calculated phase of his career. The Netherlands during the early 17th century offered something rare in Europe at the time: relative freedom for religious censorship and political surveillance. While much of the continent remained consumed by theological conflict and the violence of the 30 Years' War, Dutch cities allowed scholars to publish controversial ideas with less immediate danger. Descartes deliberately chose this environment, living quietly under conditions that allowed almost total dedication to thought. His daily life followed a disciplined rhythm shaped by solitude. Descartes avoided academic institutions and public debate whenever possible, preferring independence over reputation. He believed intellectual clarity required distance from social distraction. Frequently moving between towns, he protected his privacy so that his philosophical work could develop without interference. This withdrawal was not antisocial withdrawal, but strategic isolation. He saw himself engaged in rebuilding knowledge itself, a task demanding uninterrupted reflection. During these years, Descartes expanded the method he had first conceived in his earlier reflections. He became convinced that all reliable knowledge must proceed through orderly reasoning similar to mathematics. Complex problems should be broken into smaller parts, examined step by step, and reconstructed logically. This approach, later known as methodological rationalism, aimed to replace reliance on authority with systematic inquiry grounded in reason alone. Knowledge would no longer depend upon tradition or inherited belief, but upon clarity accessible to any thinking mind. At the same time, He pursued scientific investigations into physics, optics, and physiology. Descartes dissected animal bodies to understand biological function, treating the physical organism as a system governed by mechanical laws. He studied circulation, muscle movement, and sensory response, proposing that nerves transmitted signals through physical processes rather than spiritual forces. Such ideas marked a profound shift away from medieval explanations rooted in purpose or divine intention toward explanations based on motion and mechanism. One of his most ambitious early scientific works attempted to explain the structure of the universe itself through mechanical principles. Descartes imagined matter in constant motion, forming vortices that carried planets through space. Although later scientific developments would revise these theories, his effort represented a crucial transformation in scientific thinking. Nature was no longer interpreted symbolically, but investigated as a lawful system understandable through mathematics. However, events elsewhere in Europe forced Descartes into caution. In 1633, the Italian scientist Galileo Galilei was condemned by the Roman Catholic Church for supporting heliocentrism, the claim that Earth moves around the sun. The trial shocked intellectual communities across Europe. Descartes immediately recognized the danger. Some of his own scientific conclusions supported similar views, challenging traditional cosmology. Fearful that publication might invite condemnation, he postponed releasing major portions of his work. This moment deeply influenced his philosophical strategy. Rather than presenting science alone, Descartes decided to establish an unassailable philosophical foundation that could justify scientific inquiry itself. If reason could demonstrate certainty independent of religious interpretation, then scientific investigation might proceed more safely. This decision led to one of his most influential publications, the Discourse on the Method, released anonymously in 1637. Unlike scholarly works written in Latin for academic elites, Descartes chose to write this text in French, making it accessible to educated readers beyond universities. The work combined autobiography with philosophical argument, describing his dissatisfaction with traditional education and outlining the method he believed could guide reliable thinking. Embedded within the publication were scientific essays on optics, geometry, and meteorology, demonstrating how rational method could produce practical discovery. The discourse introduced readers to his famous reasoning that doubt itself reveals certainty. By imagining the possibility that all sensory experience might be deceptive, Descartes stripped away every belief vulnerable to uncertainty. Yet the thinking subject remained undeniable. Even deception required a thinker being deceived. From this insight, he attempted to reconstruct knowledge step by step, proving the existence of God through rational argument and asserting that a benevolent creator would not allow clear and distinct perceptions to be fundamentally false. These arguments allowed Descartes to claim that reason, properly used, could yield trustworthy knowledge about both mind and world. He established a sharp distinction between thinking substance and extended substance. Mind belonged to the realm of thought, immaterial and conscious. Body belonged to the realm of extension, measurable and mechanical. This division, later called mind-body dualism, became one of the defining features of modern philosophy. The implications of this separation were enormous. Science could now investigate physical reality without directly challenging spiritual belief, while philosophy could examine consciousness independently of material explanation. Yet this solution also introduced new problems. If mind and body were fundamentally different substances, how could they interact? Descartes proposed that interaction occurred through a small structure in the brain known as the pineal gland, though the mystery remained unresolved and would challenge philosophers for centuries. Despite growing recognition, Descartes remained cautious about fame. He corresponded extensively with scholars, princesses, and intellectual critics across Europe, refining arguments through written debate rather than public confrontation. One of his most significant correspondents was Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, whose penetrating questions forced him to clarify emotional experience and the relationship between reason and human passion. These exchanges revealed that Descartes' philosophy extended beyond abstract certainty into questions of ethics and psychological balance. By the middle of his life, Descartes had succeeded in something unprecedented. He had shifted the starting point of philosophy from the external world to the thinking subject. Knowledge, science, and certainty were now grounded in consciousness itself. His ideas were spreading rapidly, inspiring admiration as well as suspicion. Supporters saw him as the architect of a new intellectual age, while critics feared the consequences of placing human reason above inherited authority. The intellectual revolution he had initiated was still unfolding, and the later years of his life would bring both recognition and unexpected challenges as his philosophical system encountered the realities of politics, religion, and human existence beyond the safety of solitude. As René Descartes moved into the later middle period of his life, his reputation began spreading across Europe with increasing intensity. What had started as private intellectual work conducted in deliberate isolation was now influencing scholars, theologians, mathematicians, and scientists far beyond the Dutch Republic. His writings circulated widely, provoking admiration among those seeking intellectual clarity and suspicion among authorities concerned about the growing independence of reason from religious tradition. Descartes found himself in an unusual position. He had attempted to avoid controversy, yet the very method he proposed challenged centuries of accepted authority. Following the publication of the Discourse on the Method, Descartes continued refining the philosophical foundations of his system. He recognized that his earlier explanations required deeper justification, particularly concerning the certainty of knowledge and the existence of God. This effort resulted in one of his most demanding works, the Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641. Unlike his earlier accessible writing, this text addressed learned readers capable of engaging complex metaphysical argument. In the Meditations, Descartes guided readers through the same process of radical doubt he had undertaken himself. Step by step, he dismantled trust in sensory perception, memory, and even mathematical reasoning by imagining the possibility of systematic deception. The purpose was not skepticism for its own sake, but discovery of something immune to doubt. The thinking self emerged again as the first certainty. From this foundation, Descartes attempted to demonstrate that the idea of a perfect being could not originate from an imperfect mind alone, and therefore must reflect the existence of God. These arguments were strategically important. By grounding certainty in both rational thought and divine reliability, Descartes sought protection from accusations of atheism. He insisted that reason ultimately confirmed rather than threatened faith. Nevertheless, reactions remained divided. Some theologians welcomed his defense of rational belief, while others worried that beginning philosophy with individual consciousness weakened dependence on religious authority. Debate surrounding his ideas intensified through formal objections written by leading philosophers and scholars. Descartes responded carefully to critics, treating philosophical disagreement as necessary refinement rather than personal conflict. This exchange of objections and replies became one of the earliest examples of collaborative intellectual discourse in modern philosophy. Through these debates, weaknesses and strengths within his system became clearer, particularly regarding the problem of how immaterial mind interacts with physical body. During this period, Descartes also turned increasing attention toward human emotion and practical living. Contrary to the image of him as purely abstract thinker, he became deeply interested in how rational understanding could guide everyday life. His correspondence with Princess Elizabeth continued to influence this development. She pressed him repeatedly on how a purely thinking mind could experience physical emotions such as sorrow, love, or fear. Her questions forced Descartes to confront the lived complexity of human existence beyond logical certainty. These reflections culminated in his later work on the passions of the soul. Descartes analyzed emotions not as moral weaknesses, but as natural responses arising from interaction between body and mind. He argued that emotions serve practical purposes, directing attention toward survival and well-being. However, reason should guide emotional response rather than suppress it entirely. Wisdom consisted not in eliminating passion, but in understanding and regulating it through clear judgment. Meanwhile, scientific thought across Europe continued evolving rapidly. New discoveries in astronomy and physics began challenging older mechanical explanations, including some of Descartes' own cosmological theories. Yet even where his specific scientific conclusions proved inaccurate, his methodological influence endured. Scientists increasingly adopted mathematical reasoning and systematic experimentation, inspired partly by the intellectual framework he helped establish. Despite growing fame, Descartes maintained preference for controlled intellectual environments. He avoided Parisian intellectual circles known for public controversy and instead continued living quietly in the Netherlands. Privacy allowed him to work without political pressure, though complete isolation became increasingly difficult as his reputation expanded. Letters arrived constantly from admirers and critics seeking explanation or debate. By the late 1640s, however, an unexpected invitation altered the course of his final years. Queen Christina of Sweden, an intellectually ambitious ruler fascinated by philosophy and science, requested Descartes' presence at her court in Stockholm. She desired personal instruction in philosophy and saw Descartes as one of Europe's greatest living thinkers. Initially hesitant, aware of Sweden's harsh climate and demanding court life, Descartes eventually accepted after prolonged persuasion. This decision marked a profound departure from the carefully structured solitude that had sustained his work for decades. Moving north meant leaving the intellectual independence he had cultivated in the Netherlands for the formal expectations of royal service. The consequences of this choice would soon reveal how fragile philosophical contemplation could become when confronted with physical hardship and political obligation. As Descartes prepared for this final transition, his intellectual revolution was already irreversible. By placing reason and conscious thought at the center of inquiry, he had transformed philosophy's starting point forever. The modern age increasingly viewed knowledge not as inheritance from tradition, but as something constructed through investigation by the thinking subject. Yet the closing chapter of his life would unfold far from the quiet rooms in which his ideas had been born, under conditions that tested both his health and the limits of human control over circumstance. René Descartes arrived in Sweden in 1649 at the invitation of Queen Christina, entering a world profoundly different from the quiet intellectual life he had carefully maintained for most of his adulthood. Stockholm stood far to the north, shaped by long winters, severe cold, and rigid court routines that contrasted sharply with the freedom and privacy he had enjoyed in the Netherlands. Queen Christina admired philosophy deeply and wished to transform her court into a center of learning comparable to the great intellectual capitals of Europe. She regarded Descartes not merely as a scholar, but as a symbol of modern thought itself. Yet the conditions of royal service quickly proved difficult. Christina preferred conducting philosophical lessons early in the morning, often beginning before sunrise in unheated palace halls. Descartes, who throughout his life had protected his fragile health by working late and rising slowly, now found himself forced into routines entirely opposed to his natural habits. The cold Scandinavian climate further weakened him. Accustomed to long hours of reflection in warm private rooms, he struggled physically under these new demands. Despite discomfort, Descartes continued teaching the Queen, discussing ethics, metaphysics, and the nature of human happiness. Christina sought practical philosophical guidance for ruling wisely, and Descartes emphasized moderation, rational judgment, and mastery over emotional impulse. Even in this final stage of life, he remained committed to the belief that reason could guide both individual conduct and political leadership. His philosophy had always aimed not only at knowledge, but at stability within uncertainty. During his months in Sweden, Descartes also worked on philosophical reflections concerning the relationship between thought, morality, and freedom. He increasingly viewed philosophy as preparation for living well rather than merely achieving intellectual certainty. The search for indubitable knowledge that had defined his earlier work gradually expanded into concern for how human beings might maintain inner balance within unpredictable circumstances. Experience itself seemed to reinforce the limits of rational control. No method, however precise, could entirely shield life from contingency. In February 1650, after only a few months at the Swedish court, Descartes fell seriously ill. The harsh winter conditions and exhausting schedule likely contributed to pneumonia, though medical understanding at the time remained limited. Within days, his condition worsened rapidly. Surrounded not by longtime friends or familiar surroundings, but by foreign attendants in a distant country, Descartes faced the end of his life far from the solitude that had nurtured his intellectual achievements. He died on February 11th, 1650, at the age of 53. The philosopher who had sought absolute certainty about existence itself passed away under circumstances shaped largely by chance and environment, a quiet reminder of the limits confronting even the most rational human project. His death initially attracted modest attention compared to the political events of Europe, yet the intellectual consequences of his work continued expanding long after his passing. In the decades following his death, Descartes' philosophy reshaped the direction of Western thought. By beginning inquiry with a thinking subject, he helped inaugurate what would later be called modern philosophy. Questions concerning consciousness, perception, knowledge, and personal identity increasingly replaced reliance on inherited authority. Thinkers who agreed with him and those who opposed him alike were forced to respond to the framework he established. His separation between mind and body profoundly influenced science and medicine. The human body came to be studied as a physical system governed by laws accessible to experimentation, contributing to advances in physiology and mechanics. At the same time, his dualism created enduring philosophical challenges concerning consciousness that remain unresolved even in contemporary neuroscience. The problem of how subjective experience relates to physical processes continues, tracing its origins to Cartesian thought. In mathematics, his invention of analytic geometry permanently altered scientific possibility. The coordinate system allowed physical motion to be described numerically, enabling later developments in calculus, physics, engineering, and technology. Modern scientific civilization rests partly upon tools he helped create while pursuing philosophical clarity. Yet perhaps his most lasting legacy lies in a shift of intellectual attitude. Descartes encouraged individuals to question assumptions, examine belief critically, and seek justification through reason rather than tradition alone. Doubt, once viewed as dangerous instability, became a method for discovering truth. The modern emphasis on inquiry, skepticism, and personal investigation owes much to this transformation. At the same time, critics would later argue that his focus on the individual mind contributed to feelings of separation between humanity and nature, between subject and world. The modern sense of isolation, sometimes associated with rational individualism, can also be traced to the philosophical turn he initiated. In attempting to secure certainty, Descartes unintentionally opened questions about identity and reality that later philosophers would struggle to reconcile. The image that remains at the end of his story is that of a solitary thinker determined to rebuild knowledge from its foundations. Living during an age of confusion and conflict, he sought stability not through authority or tradition, but through the simple recognition that thinking itself reveals existence. From that starting point, he attempted to construct a universe understandable through reason. René Descartes left behind no political empire and commanded no army, yet his influence penetrated more deeply than many rulers of his time. Every modern inquiry that begins by asking how we know what we know carries the echo of his project. His life represents humanity's enduring effort to find certainty within uncertainty, to understand reality through reflection, and to ground knowledge in the quiet but undeniable fact of conscious awareness itself.